Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to our seminar this morning. My name is Fred Marks. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. And our seminar this morning is called Sharing Staff, More for Your Money. For properties working with tighter budgets, it may make sense to share staff members with neighboring buildings or associations in order to trim overhead and administrative costs. At this seminar, you'll learn how you can join forces with other landlords or property managers to deliver quality building support services while saving money. Issues like scheduling, payroll, chain of command will be discussed, as well as liability and insurance issues. To discuss this topic, we have a panel of distinguished experts here that I'd like to introduce to you. To my immediate right, to my immediate right, we have Joe we have Joe Balsamo, who is president and owner of Alliance Property Management, a management company located in Morristown, New Jersey. He's exhibiting at booth 430, so please stop by and visit him. Next to Joe, we have Scott Pennick, who is the chair of corporate at McGovern Legal Services. McGovern Legal Services is one of the top legal attorney agencies, law firms in New Jersey. They handle over 500 associations here in New Jersey, so they know what they're talking about. And next to Scott, we have Elaine Warger-Murray, who is the president and owner of Regency Management Group. Regency Management Group is one of the top boutique management companies in New Jersey. And we're very pleased to have all three of them with us here on the panel. What we're going to do is we have a series of questions. We're going to ask them. They're going to respond to it. And after a few rounds of questions, I'm going to turn it over to the audience for Q&A. So any questions that you might have, please hold till the end, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So we'd like to begin our question and answer with Joe Balsamo. And our first question for Joe is, Joe, how common is it for two or more buildings or HOAs to share on-site staff members like superintendents, groundskeepers, handymen, et cetera? And why might a board be interested in sharing with another property?
Good morning. Can everybody hear me? As Fred said, I'm Joe Balsamo with Alliance Property Management. For the first question, yes, I would say it's very common in today's competitive market to share people and to share resources. We share a number of resources from property management, property managers to plumbers to electricians, landscapers, snow removal people, painters, masonry work. We try to offer services that obviously are conducive to each property. But typically, if we're scheduling jobs, especially we know that one property very close proximity to another property might be doing a roofing or a painting or a siding job, we'll look to obviously have them address those jobs collectively in the form, and the reason is to try to get them the best possible job and the best possible price. So yes, it is very common.
As a follow-up, I can add that, can everyone hear me? My mic on? And one area that it works particularly well in is in buildings that are close by, either next door to each other. We have clusters of communities. So, for example, window washing is one area where we've been able to save a tremendous amount of money. Well, because the idea of bringing the equipment to go up, even if you only have a mid-rise, is very expensive. So what we've been doing is, for all of our window washing, we've actually contracted so that the window washing occurs at the same time within a block or so, and it saves at least 30% for each of the buildings. That's one that's very, very common. Another one that works very well is porter and janitoring. Porters have a tendency to have some messy buildings and some buildings that are not so messy. However, everybody wants to have a porter there a certain number of days. So what we try and do is utilize the porters in the way that the messy building gets their correct number of days, and when the other building does not need as much time or needs more time, we can split the time more appropriately. Those are two areas that are specific to some of the buildings that we do. In some of the larger communities, we're able to do concrete and paving so that there isn't one community that is completely in disarray while the roads are being resurfaced or concrete work is being done. So there's a little bit of a let rest time while they go next door or they go down the street.
Thank you very much. Our next question is for our attorney, Scott Pennick. Scott, from a legal liability perspective, what considerations should a board or management team take into account when deciding whether to share staff with another building or community?
Right. So we're thinking about on-site people here. One of the keys, I think, especially if your community is so small that you're considering sharing versus hiring your own dedicated people, is to consider whether you want to be an employer or not. And I would say no. You don't want to be a direct employer. For some reason, that seems in vogue in certain neighborhoods. For some reason, the association feels like it's a little more sophisticated to have their own employed staff. There's so many employment issues that associations really aren't organized to handle. Instead, what I recommend and what I've seen work pretty well is working through a vendor, like a management company. So maybe you want on-site management. And what I've seen communities do successfully is, even if they can't afford 40 hours a week on site for management, maybe 2 or 3 days a week on site dedicated works well for them. And a lot of management companies, particularly like Elaine said, if they have buildings nearby, communities nearby, you might be able to work out an arrangement where you have someone on site 3 days a week, 2 days a week, and they're at a neighboring community additional days a week. Or if you have a neighboring community, I've also seen this, that doesn't have their own on-site office, but they would like your person to be their person too, and you're next door, you know, those people can share your manager. You could possibly get a 5 days. So I have a couple of clients that they have a 5-day-a-week on-site person, but the HOA, single-family homes that don't have an on-site office, they're able to come over to the condominium association that does have a clubhouse and an office. That person is also their on-site manager. They do it through a management company. They don't employ the person directly. And then the manager is able to serve 2 communities simultaneously, being on site. And it makes sense for the management company then to pay a quality person enough where you get what you pay for. Right? So like, don't drive the price down. A good property manager is the most important person that you can hire really for your community.
We like Scott a lot.
No, it's just true. Unfortunately, bad property managers make us more money, but good property managers will see every extra dollar you pay for a property manager probably saves you, $5 on your attorney. So I've seen those.
It's true.
It is true. And I think those relationships tend to work well. We don't have a lot of communities with on-site superintendents, and so one of the things you have to worry about with a superintendent too really is physical proximity. Some unions have a requirement, right, that the person, so this is a legal issue, liability issue, they worry about whether or not the person's within so many feet of a building. So if you've got to live in at a building, it's going to have to be next door. And then the other thing, I don't want to, staying within my topic here, you've got to talk to your insurance broker. This is like the end or beginning of every answer I give to my clients about almost everything, right, is call your insurance broker, right? Especially if you're a New Jersey community. New Jersey insurance brokers are licensed professionals. They give you advice. They're not just order takers. My understanding is in New York that they are pretty much just order takers. In New Jersey, they're licensed professionals. They're going to be able to advise you about whether your policy covers the arrangement that you want. And when you're talking about property managers especially, there'll almost always be additional insureds. A key is making sure that your fidelity bond or your crime policy or your theft policy, whatever it's called through your carrier, is adequate and will cover this person if they have any kind of access to your financials. So I see communities all the time, they have $25,000 in theft coverage. That is insane. You have $1 million in the bank in your reserve account, and if somebody funnels that into their gambling habit because they have access to your account, and you only have $25,000 in coverage, that is crazy. I mean, I just saw it last week, right? From a client, they were doing an FHA application to be approved, so they have to send us all their insurance policies. We're doing the application for them. They had $25,000 in theft coverage. And I told them you have to raise it to $850,000 if you want to be approved. I mean, that's how far off some people are. And this is key if you have somebody on site, you're sharing staff, who is going to have access to your bank accounts or investments and things like that for the association.
As a follow-up to that liability, though, one of the reasons for having a professional manager, and I'm speaking, of course, on my behalf, but you can certainly respond, is that I have found so often where individual buildings or individual associations will hire their own employee and call them a manager. That is, a dangerous thing from a liability standpoint. The main purpose of having a manager is to reduce your liability as a board. Obviously, as a manager, you need to reduce your own liability as well. But the issue of liability is one which is key. In fact, I just wrote an article that's going to be published by in Community Trends next month, specifically addressing the issue of the liabilities that most board members take on because they're trying to save money or trying to do things in an expeditious manner, which is all good. But the thing is, you want to transfer that liability to somebody else, so that, for example, if you're both using the same guy doing your paving, and that paving contractor is doing it on specs, would you agree having an engineer?
Oh, yeah.
Agreed.
Use an engineer, yeah.
Because, again, the idea is to reduce your liability. And that's one of the big issues associated with even the sharing of the staff, right?
Right.
Sure. I would like to also add, that's a very good point. We have a couple of buildings where in one property, a manager has an office space, and another property, it's large but doesn't have office space. So technically, both properties share one office. So essentially, with that being said, the adjoining community has to provide liability coverage for the manager as he works on both properties and vice versa. In addition with that, the prior or adjacent property has to pay this property for office space. So it becomes something where they're utilizing the same space and they're getting a benefit. It also allows, because the properties are in such close proximity, that in the event of emergency, a manager can get from one location to another. But as Elaine pointed out, the liability always has to be addressed with your association and always with your insurance company to make sure that in the event something does happen, the liability is not with your association or with your board or your community.
Great. I think you could see why I call these people experts. They really know what they're talking about, and they're providing a lot of great information for you. Elaine, our next question is for you. And aside from just saving money, what are some of the upsides of 2 or more buildings or associations sharing staff among them, and what are some of the potential drawbacks?
One drawback is envy. Everybody's jealous that whoever's getting the person is getting more service, getting better service, or because they like them better. They're being nicer to them. And that sounds like a very simple, but it's a very base emotion. But envy is one area. Again, the conscientious documentation of time, as well as the utilization of work tickets, is essential. Because when you use work tickets or require that your management company have all vendors or employees, like a janitorial porter, maintenance, et cetera, they have to be accountable. And that helps deal with the issue of envy, because they want to know why they're over there when they should be over here. Now, maybe they had an emergency next door, and because you're sharing staff, that has to be documented so it can be reported to the board. So one drawback is envy. Another one is that there is a benefit in the sense that envy can also help them, each association, to recognize that the board has made a decision to do some extra painting over here. Like, why isn't he painting this on our building? And that helps the community understand the financial and fiscal constraints. Oftentimes, one community is willing to spend more money than the other, and then they'll be jealous. And they'll say, why are all their yellow spots at their parking areas all nice and bright and ours are faded? And reason being is that there is the dollars for that. So that's one of the, those are some of the drawbacks. So, some of the benefits, obviously, are the flexibility. We have had instances where painting is shared, but at different times of the year, different buildings or different communities need things painted at a different time. For example, interior paint versus exterior paint. So we can utilize a contractor to do painting, but on the exterior, they can work where the highest number of exterior things need to be painted versus doing the other work of interior on the bad days. So when it's raining and it's not doing so well outside, that's when they can work inside. So the flexibility as well as the function are the two absolute benefits of it, besides cost effectiveness. And then the drawback, of course, is the nature of everyone to want to know where they are, what they're doing, why they're doing it. And so that has to be documented. And so the answer for that is significant amounts of documentation and utilization of work tickets.
I think one of the other big challenges is who's the boss, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you...
The manager.
Right. But if you are, if you're answering to 2 boards or 3 boards or something like that, who's the boss? Who do I listen to first? I mean, that is a challenge, right? And to a certain degree, you try to work that out in the arrangement ahead of time, write everything down. Not being clear is not being kind, but it's going to be a challenge. Who's the boss? Who do I respond to? Is it the community that pays more? What if they pay 50-50? How do I make these decisions? That's a big challenge, and there's not always an easy answer. A lot of times you have to rely on boards or if you have 2 managers that have personalities that work well together. Right, and just people being reasonable, and then keeping up with the work tickets and figuring out if one community is using more than their fair share of the person's time and resources.
Yeah, and I think the documentation is the key to that. Because in fact, the manager, how many people here in this building, in this room right here, have board members that will say to any contractor, anyone working, "Excuse me, I need you to do this now," or "Could you please do this?" Those are the 2 most favorite phrases. "Could you please do this? Could you please help me? I need you to do this now." And the way, again, is through education and documentation and having a good relationship with your boards.
While we're talking about documentation, that happens to be the next question coming up for Scott. And Scott, discuss the documents and paperwork, tax forms, insurance, payroll certificates, licenses, et cetera, that need to be in order when 2 buildings share, say, a superintendent. Is each building considered a separate employer, or is there just one set of documents between the 2 of them? And who keeps all that on file, and how should that information be secured?
So I'm going to go back to how I started my last one and say, don't be the employer. Don't be the direct employer. We have several communities that directly employ staff, but the ones that it's legitimate that they do it, in my opinion, they have 20, 30, 40 employees. So they have real HR. They have people who know how to deal with making sure proper deductions come out of paychecks. You're going to have to utilize additional vendors probably to service your function as an employer, like ADP or Paychex or someone to process your payroll, which is extra costs on top of the employee's salary, benefits. Don't forget, you pay half of the FICA and the Medicare, right? All of these things are extra costs. You got to make sure all of that stuff happens. I will say again that the insurance is key. No matter what the case, you may need a different insurance policy if you have direct employees. You probably will in certain of your policies, or it may cost more, versus using a contractor, using a management company, or using a porter service or some other kind of company like that. So I really encourage you to go that way. And then there's not a lot of answer to this question for me, because guess why? You just have a contract with that vendor and they take care of all of it. And then you just want to have a good person on site, have a good relationship with them, and make sure if you're doing a sharing situation, which is what we're talking about here, that you have a protocol in place, that you're documenting things. But if you do choose to be an employer, I would recommend, I think the cleanest way to do it would be for one party to be the employer. That person is bearing more burden, of course, so compensation or payment from the other association is going to have to take that into consideration. But it's going to be increasingly complicated, and I think you're going to risk running into things like overtime laws and violating them.
OSHA?
And, right, OSHA, and just other kinds of employment-related liability issues, that come along with being a direct employer. And if you're both employers, does this person have two separate jobs really? Is it one job? Do they have two part-time jobs? Are they really a full-time employee? I mean, the fun questions your attorney will get to answer and figure out will add up to quite a bit of billing, probably, depending on all the finer little details of your arrangement and who really has a say over this person's actions and what they do. And maybe you have two, maybe you are, in the eyes of the court, two employers, even though your agreement says, no, Association A, you're the employer. So you could even intend to have one firm be the employer and the other one is essentially contracting out services from the neighboring association. But in fact, you're, in the eyes of the court or the Department of Labor, you're also an employer inadvertently, essentially. So I'm just going to go back to, if you're looking at sharing, I don't think you should take on the responsibility and the liabilities that come with being a direct employer. I really recommend finding a service provider that can do all of that for you, take on a lot of the liability, the headache, the cost, the overhead, and hopefully you're getting economies of scale by doing that because they have a whole back office that serves lots of staff that they employ, not your one or two people that you're sharing with another community.
I'd like to add that when we set up for employee sharing and employee sharing, we have contracts, direct contracts with each property. So we start with direct contracts for services. So for example, property A might have the employee for 3 days, property B might have the employee for 2 days. Then from that perspective, it's a question of maybe potentially office space, in which case we have to have an aside agreement or side contract for that particular space. In addition to that, obviously for us keeping track of time for each association, time is a factor. If we have to set up payroll for each one of those folks for each location, each property has to have a separate payroll account for that particular employee that has to be funded. And then usually what we do is we typically use a service, a payroll service for that function. In addition to that, if there's any related project work that needs to get done prior to doing any project work, we make sure that there's also an express discussion for that particular service, whether that's supervising additional work or scoping additional work or facilitating additional work. Like Elaine said, maybe even for a paving job, you might bring in a supplemental person like an engineer. You would do that. Again, there would be a contract. So all these documents that we're talking about have to be kept by the management office. It is quite entailed. But the last element, as Scott indicated, is we'd have to make sure that each association properly provides the documentation, i.e. from the insurance companies, and they each know via their insurance agents where there's an overlap in services and how the liability is obligated to the associations and to the general public as such as that. But all those documentations and all those documents and contracts are kept in the management office. In addition to that, while we have multiple associations, each association is an independent entity. And while each association is an independent nonprofit corporation in the state of New Jersey, that's typically how they're set up, each association has separate documentations and separate contracts and separate agreements and separate liability insurances and separate. All those things have to be kept with each property. Those records belong to the homeowners association, the board of directors, and the community. Pretty much that's what you have to do in terms of holding on to all the documents and supporting these actions while you're trying to save costs. Is it entailed? Yes. Is it a lot of paperwork? Yes. And you need to make sure that you have somebody that's properly knowledgeable on what documents are necessary so that these functions can be properly supported. Thank you.
We do something differently. One of the things that we do is that we are the employer. we do not have a situation where we contract with this association and then we contract with this association. We are the employer. When they have a need for a maintenance man, as an example, or a maintenance supervisor, they contract with my firm. Once they have contracted with my firm, they have a separate contract. We are the payee. We're the ones who actually pay the employment taxes. We pay the individual. It's our payroll. All of that liability falls on the manager. So very little liability falls on the association. When they obviously have to have proper insurance, as do we, for that type of individual. And that type of individual, by the way, has a much higher rate of insurance workers' comp liability. And that's one of the reasons why it's better to have a management company, because when you have your own employee, workers' comp rates go way up. Whereas when we build it into our price scope, it is more evenly distributed. You know, like for example, let's say the base rate of a workers' comp insurance is, you know, here. And if we have it together, it's on us. We're able to do it a little bit lower, because even though the rate is the same, because we're dividing it over a variety of people, that workers' comp claim insurance coverage is lower. So in most cases, we are the employer. We then have contracts with our clients. The way to ensure, as was previously mentioned, is that you do have to maintain that documentation, and the work ticket system, as well as the appropriate documentation, as well as specific job descriptions. I cannot tell you how often I have taken sites over where they don't even know the idea of a job description. We want him to do this and that, and sometimes this. No, that's not a job description. A formal job description is a document that must, in my opinion, be part of any staffing or contracted relationship. When a person has a job to do, including a property manager, we're one of the few companies, I think, that actually provides to our clients a job description for the property manager, a job description for the on-site administrator, a job description for every single individual who works in any capacity. And as board members, to insist on that is as important as your insurance coverage. It's as important as your legal liability, understanding, having your contracts always reviewed by the attorney. But those job descriptions are essential. It also creates a protection, because what you really want in any type of staffing environment is staff longevity. One of the things that's most important in any building, in any community, is knowledge of the components, knowledge of what, you know, where the ice will collect during snowstorms, where there's going to be a potential problem with drainage, whatever kind of problems that happen, and familiarity with the systems, the mechanical systems. So you want staff longevity. One way to achieve staff longevity is to utilize a management company. I've had many instances where, especially in adult communities, and you know, I don't know if anybody here live in an adult community. Anybody? Okay, then I can be very, very well. I'd be frank anyway, unfortunately. But adult communities tend to think that it's better to have their own staffing, so that they can tell them what to do, when to do it. But it tends not to have a job description, and it also makes the individual loyal to the wrong people. The person who invites them in for coffee while they're supposed to be doing work to get paid. Anyone hear of that before? So that type of documentation is very important as well.
Great. We have time for one last question with some quick answers, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. And I'm just going to throw it out to actually all three of you. As a management professional, how does staff sharing simplify or complicate your job in serving your clients' communities? And I'm sure we probably already answered a lot of that already. but-
I think it's been answered a couple times
Yeah.
by each of us. And I think, for me, the simplest way is to have us be the employer, so I know exactly what my liability is, and I can and I can explain that liability or lack of liability to my boards. In terms of making our job easier, it does make our job easier because nothing is worse than having a client tell me, we have this guy and we pay him cash or, you ever hear, am I saying stuff you haven't heard about? We pay this guy cash. Oh, no, he's been working for us a long time. No, we like him. And I can't do it. Cannot do it. Can't do it. Can't do it.
I would agree with Elaine. We do not suggest having employees that work for cash either. But I will also say, what I find is the biggest complication in all of it is, while there's a lot to do, as you've heard, there's a number of factors that consider. I think ultimately what it comes down is that each association is uniquely different. They each have their own thoughts about things and how things should be working. And each association is ultimately responsible to their communities, their public offering statements, and their documents. And at the end of the day, we find that the biggest factor in everything is really about personalities, making sure that we have the right fit for the job. And sometimes that's not always doable by having that sharing idea. So those are things that have to be considered as well.
Can I get some questions from out here? Anybody have a question for our group?
Hi, my name's Kevin, and I'm a property manager. I do have a client that has their own staff, and we fight with the fact that the staff is incompetent and they need to be replaced. But they've been there forever, they know all the stuff, but they're losing money because they're not getting the productivity out of the staff they need. I've recommended to them that we provide staffing, and they don't want that profit and all that on top. They're saving all that money by not doing it. So I'm trying to show them the two sides. But my question is there overtime? How do you deal with the overtime? Is that a specific line item in your contract when you provide that employment for the clients?
Yeah, we typically have that overtime over so many hours is obviously attributable, especially if you have emergency calls and such as that. So that does become a factor. In the middle of the night, something happens and you have to go out there, weren't anticipated, then obviously that would be overtime. Whether it's going to be time and a half, that's a different issue, but that does become a factor. It is something that is arranged in our contracts. I don't disagree with, I'm sorry, your name, sir? Kevin, I don't disagree with you. We've taken on properties where the staff is incompetent, and quite frankly, they'll have maybe an apartment, and they work there, and they've been there for 25 years, and they're basically, somehow related to a board member, or there's some other issue like that. I don't feel comfortable with those situations. I try to minimize them, because I do find that while you think you're saving money by hiring so-and-so, you're really not. I mean, at the end of the day, when something comes to be a problem, the full liability will never sit with that employee. The full liability will sit with the homeowners association and the management office. And sometimes we have to insist that we're not looking to do that, especially pay cash, or we have to decide that, is this a client that we really want to retain?
Another thing is that we always do a cash benefit analysis. Whenever we even bid an association, and the association comes forward and says, we have this staff, we love these guys love us, and they know everything. I sit down with them and I do a cost-benefit analysis, including the cost of the apartment. Because there's utilities associated with that apartment. There's what would be the potentiality for income if you were able to rent it, because some municipalities have now changed their regulations where the superintendent does not have to live on site. And how do you account for that in their pay? And the new laws require that you have to give them a 1099 or some other actual accounting for how that money is included. So if you do a cost-benefit analysis, it generally works out, especially that I won't take on a site if they don't require job descriptions. I won't take it on. If you don't have job descriptions and you don't use work tickets, and I can't account for the time and the productivity of these people that you love, unfortunately, we cannot take that responsibility because you are their employer. And if you want to be their employer, you cannot entrust me or my manager with the responsibility of getting the work done within a constrained budget that you have. So as soon as I present it, not quite that harshly, because I'm talking to you, I do soften it a bit. Actually, I usually have one of my managers say it. This is how I talk to my managers. I'll say, you explain to those people that they have to understand what this is costing. Here's how much the rent is. Here's how much the utilities are. And then we do require job descriptions and the work ticket system. And in most cases, I always suggest retaining at least some of those employees on a probationary period and having the board comply with that, because you don't want to lose people who do know where the bodies are buried and where the pipes go. And sometimes they deliberately tell you the wrong stuff because they want job security. So what we do is we develop employment contracts. I didn't mention this earlier when I talked about job descriptions, but I also have found that there are no employment contracts. You'll come into a site and they say, oh, we have these people, we love them, we love them. Really, where's their employment contract so I can see? There is none. So this goes back to documentation.
Yep. And Kevin, one thing I would throw in there is use, you're the manager, or use your other professionals to talk to your board as well. As an attorney, obviously we represent the association, but we like to think of ourselves as like team members with the manager too. Hopefully we've got a good manager on board. And you can use the attorney, say, hey, maybe we want them to come in, or maybe we should ask the attorney whether it's a good idea for you guys to have these direct employees. You could even, like Elaine was talking about, doing a cost-benefit analysis. They might respect it more if it came from the accountant. Hey, let's see how much it will cost to get the accountant to do a cost-benefit analysis. I'm happy to give them all of our information as a manager, what it will cost. And, they look through your records every year anyway for the audit. Let's have them look through and tell us what the true cost of this employee is. So use the other professionals when people start hearing the same message from different voices that they respect and sort of different categories, I think it can help get a point across.
Just one follow-up on your question. When you're dealing with sharing services and staff and things like that, are there any issues that come up that are union related? Are there some things you can't do because unions are involved and they don't let you do it or anything like that?
Unions are a problem.
Unions are a problem.
In terms of sharing staff. The only time that I've been able to utilize a union employee is in a plumbing environment, and that person has they're a member of the plumbers union, and so that is okay because we have to acclimate to the plumbers union's rights. But under normal circumstances, in some of the areas in some of the states where we have porters that are part of a union, or you have maintenance supervisors that are part of a union, that sharing of staff does not work because of the number of hours, and if they happen to go overtime 1 minute because they had to go next door. So we use unions in certain buildings, and we use a union plumber in very often cases. And in some cases, we've used union stonemasons because we do a lot of stone masonry work, retaining walls, and that kind of thing. So when we're using someone who belongs to a union, that's fine. But when you have a group of people that are actually employed in a building that are part of a union, then it becomes really more trouble than it's worth.
I think it makes the direct employment situation even more disadvantageous, and really you're going to need to use an outside vendor probably if you want to use union staff. It's going to be very difficult to have a collective bargaining agreement for a essentially part-time employee. I just don't see it happening. The union's not going to see that as good for them or a good precedent to set, And I don't think you're going to be able to work that way in a direct employment situation, which goes back to my theme of if you're thinking about sharing, you're
Don't
really
be
not
an
big enough to
employer.
be a direct employer. And even if you're big enough, you probably don't want to do it.
The only thing I'll add to that is that I have to be careful to make sure that whomever I'm using is the right fit for it. For example, I won't let a staff person particularly try to take on a plumbing job or an electrical job. You know, so for those instances, we have to be cognizant of what the work is. And for those jobs, because of liability and some of the issues that we've heard discussed today, we have to make sure that we have licensed personnel with their own insurance to take on those.
Yeah, don't have your maintenance guy do the electrical work.
Exactly.
Okay, well, I want to thank everybody. That brings us to the close of this seminar. Round of applause for our three panelists here. They did a
Thank
great
you.
job. They're all three exhibiting. Please visit them at their booth, and they're also going to stay up here in case you want to come and talk to them one-on-one right now. Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for attending.
Thank you.